From Daniel Cormier being caught with steroids to Tank Abbott laughing at his opponent's convulsions, here are the biggest meltdowns in UFC history. Starting with the time Daniel Cormier got himself into a pretty awkward situation. So basically, Old Man Dan was caught with steroids. And in case you didn't know, before he beat Stipe Miocic at UFC 226, Daniel was the first to hold both the light and heavyweight titles simultaneously. Though at the same time, he was also a popular internet meme. At UFC 214, Cormier fought John Jones for the light heavyweight title. And as you know, Jones had been Cormier's rival for a long time. Now, DC did well in the first few rounds of the 5-round fight, but Jones won that night. He knocked out Cormier with a head kick in the 3rd round to win back the title. That's when things took a turn for the worse. He was caught using steroids. Most people remember UFC 214 because of a picture of a grown man crying. The crying face Cormier meme quickly joined the famous crying Michael Jordan meme as a way to show your true feelings when you don't like something. Yikes. While that's bad, this next guy is the meanest person who ever fought in the octagon, or even the meanest person who's ever lived, Brock Lesnar. You might not think of him when you think of a meltdown after a fight, but what he did after beating Frank Mir at UFC 100 fits the bill. At UFC 100, the Beast got back at Mir for beating him in their first fight a year earlier. Lesnar beat Mir so hard that it was hard to tell if it was a sport or an attack. People will remember that night most for how Lesnar acted after beating Mir. After Lesnar knocked Mir out, he ran to the cameras, still angry and spitting out foam. He spat at the camera, threw his mouthpiece, and ran back up to Mir as if to keep beating him. Then, to top it all off, he went on his now famous rant after the fight, where he said some terrible things. So that was a pretty big meltdown, just like this next one, where everybody knows this next guy for being great at analyzing fights, but you probably didn't know that before he was analyzing fights with Kenny Florian, the Brit was doing what he does best, making trouble. Michael Bisping. Sure, he's had some memorable fights, no doubt, but the one with Jorge Rivera may have been the most embarrassing. At UFC 127, a grudge match was held between these two middleweight fighters. Bisping knocked out Rivera with punches in the 2nd round, but it's what the Brit did after the fight that people still talk about today. After beating Rivera, Bisping went to his opponent's corner and teased them with middle fingers, swear words, and even spat on Rivera's coach. So that was definitely a shocker. If you've been watching MMA for the last 10 years, you probably know this next guy and his fighting style, Paul Daly. Before he knocked out fighters like Lorenz Larkin and John Fitch, Daly was destroying UFC welterweights one by one. Josh Koscheck and Daly would settle their disagreement at UFC 113, but Daly wouldn't be able to do it in 15 minutes. Most of the time, Koscheck was in charge of the fight against Daly. This made Daly nervous and angry, and made him want to hit Koscheck after the match was over. Referee Dan Miragliotta was there to shove Daly out of the way, but the damage had already been done. Because of what Daly did, Dana White, the president of the UFC, would never let Semtex fight inside the octagon again. Though this next Japanese fighter created quite the scene too. Shinya Aoki. Having been in more than 50 fights, Shinya's a controversial figure in a country where most people are conservative. Aoki's most memorable antics after a fight would happen at Dynamite 2009. That's when things really went down. Aoki beat Mizuto Hirota with a hammerlock that broke Hirota's arm. But that doesn't mean he had a meltdown after the match. What Aoki did after that is what put him on this list. After breaking Hirota's arm, Aoki stood right over his fallen opponent and gave him the middle finger, while yelling insults at Hirota's half-conscious body. Yikes, that's pretty unforgettable. And speaking of, who could forget how bad Strikeforce Nashville was? Yep, I'm talking about Jason Miller. What was supposed to be MMA's big debut on network TV turned out to be a disaster very quickly. The main event was when Jake Shields beat Dan Henderson, but the real show was what happened during the interview after the fight. During Shields' interview, Jason Miller would move to the middle of the cage. Miller could be heard asking Shields for his rematch, but Shields' teammates didn't like Mayhem's interruption, and a riot broke out. Most likely, the Strikeforce Nashville riot is why it took so long for MMA to get back on network TV. You may be confused now, trying to figure out why this next guy is on this list. Well, I can tell you it's not because of the boomerang thing with Colby Covington. Fabricio Verdum. The only reason this guy's on the list is because what happened after he beat Travis Brown at UFC 203. This would be the second time in 2 years that the Brazilian beat the American, which made Brown's coach, Edmond Tarverdyan, even more upset. As the fighters got into place for the official reading of the decision, Tarverdyan yelled at Verdum. And I'm not sure what he really said, but the Brazilian was so angered by what he said that he tried to give Tarverdyan a front kick. Chaos was to be expected after that, just as in the next meltdown that happened with a duo, Conor McGregor and Charlie Ward. Ward found a place to fight after being kicked out of the UFC. He didn't have to wait long for his first official fight for the Viacom-owned promotion, and debuted at Bellator 187 in Dublin, Ireland, just 3 months after signing on. Ward beat John Redmond by TKO with 1 second left in the first round. But after that, it was hard to tell what was happening inside the cage. Shortly after Ward knocked Redmond down, a man in a dark hooded sweatshirt ran into the cage and tackled Ward. Everyone had to think for a while before figuring out that the sweatshirt man was Conor McGregor. Referee Mark Goddard didn't like what McGregor was doing, so he kicked him out of the ring. But that didn't stop MMA's biggest star from doing whatever he wanted. After getting paid by Floyd Mayweather, he jumped into the cage like a crazy person. To top it all off, he hit the security guard, who told him to sit down. And this went down as one of the worst meltdowns after a fight in MMA history. Although, I guess this next guy did something equally unforgettable. And he might just be able to challenge Brock Lesnar for the title of the meanest fighter in MMA history, Tank Abbott. Billed as a pit fighter who could bench press more than 600 pounds, Abbott has more than 200 street fights to his credit. He was perfect for combat sports. And he looked and acted like a badass biker. But this wasn't just an act for Abbott. He really liked playing the bad guy. Tank made his debut at UFC 6 and fought thrice that night. But it only took him 20 seconds to knock out John Matua in his first fight. What happened next is what got Abbott into trouble. As his opponent lay on the ground with his eyes rolled back in his head and doctors hovering over him, Abbott laughed at Matua's convulsions. And that set the stage for one of the meanest men the sport has ever seen. With that, that's all for the biggest meltdowns in UFC history.